Hello, this is the fourth session in our course Theories of Violent Conflict, and today we'll talk about violence in structures. But I'll start with a documentary. I Am Not Your Negro, from Roel Peck, made in 2016. I'm Not Your Negro is a documentary which tells the story of an uncompleted book project of the American writer and activist James Baldwin. When Baldwin died in 1987, he only completed about 30 pages of the book with some notes. And the plan of the book was to write about the United States, and particularly about the lives of three of Baldwin's friends, all murdered before they turned 40: Megan Avers, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X. The documentary begins in the middle of a conversation on the Dick Cavett show. It's 1968, and Dick Cavett, the host, sort of playing the devil's advocate, asks James Baldwin why Negroes aren't optimistic, even though there are Negro mayors, there are Negroes in all sports, there are Negroes in politics, they're even accorded the ultimate accolade of being in television commercials now. Cavett pauses and asks why Baldwin is smiling. And then he answers, "It's not a question of what happens to the Negro here, the black man here," Baldwin says. That's a very vivid question for me, but the real question is what's going to happen to this country. I have to repeat that. Now, what Baldwin does here, and eloquently does throughout the documentary, is to shift away the focus on the black angry community to the organization of American society as a whole, and thereby aiming to address the normalization and institutionalization of inequality, exploitation, and repression. So the topic of how people play a role in systems that can produce inequality and destruction and exploitation is also highlighted in two completely different works. One is a film called Margin Call, in which we see the top dog, so to say, struggle with the financial crisis of 2008 and playing the game of the global casino capitalism. And the other film is a documentary which is a fantastic introduction into understanding and explaining the way the global capitalist economy functions today, and particularly these notions of financialization that are turned into a movie in Margin Call, are explained very thoroughly. So if you like to sort of get both an inside view and an explanation, these two films are very helpful. Another film that I could very, very strongly recommend is the documentary called 13th by Ava DuVernay from 2016, which very much looks at the intersection of race, justice, and mass incarceration in the United States. So, but all these works step away from a focus on the individual and his or her drives and instincts and needs and motives, and shifts our gaze to how the organization of society, how systems can be destructive, and how important it is that we understand and unravel and unpack and study these systems. And that is very hard. That's very well explained in her book Expulsions by Saskia Sassen, the sociologist from Columbia University. I think she makes a very important observation in that book when stating how the sheer complexity of the global economy makes it hard to trace lines of responsibility for the violence it produces, but also how equally hard it is for those who benefit from the system to feel responsible for the harm done. In that sense, Margin Call gives us that view. but we can also immediately apply it to ourselves as consumer citizens, especially if we would be consumer citizens in the West, and how unaware we are or like to remain of how our patterns of consumption, our daily organization of our daily lives, in fact, plays out in ways that are destructive in other places. So that dynamics of power and complexity is something that particularly the structuralist views on violent conflict and war want to bring out. So that's very much what also Saskia Sassen is highlighting, the problem of where to locate power in complexity, a problem prominently manifested in our interconnected times, and therefore a very big question for us conflict analysts. So maybe then first, before we enter into the lecture, what is the core of this approach? This approach that is our focus this week, and that is a structuralist view on violent conflict and war. What is the core argument from authors arguing from a more structure-based analysis of conflict? What I think is characterizing this approach is very clearly structure-based approaches locate the source of violent conflict in the organization of society. As we saw last week, we looked, in the week before, these sessions 2 and 3, we very much emphasized the dynamics of instincts and motives of actors and human beings. And we, for instance, looked upon how people act upon insecurities, for instance, insecure identity or an insecure group status, and how that in some occasions would result into violent action. But today we ask a whole bunch of different questions. We would be interested, what are the institutional and material sources of insecurity? And what we'll emphasize a lot in this lecture is one particular global or larger system that is structured in a certain way, and that is the system of the global political economy as playing an important role in understanding local conflicts, and how then to make that connection between such a large system as a global capitalist economy and the phenomena of violent conflict in the world today. So how to make that link. Political economy is a tradition, an academic tradition that aims to make that effort, and we could argue that maybe that's good to address beforehand. Is the study of the role of economic processes in shaping society and history. So basically arguing it's the economy, stupid, in explaining a lot of social phenomena and political phenomena. What is underlying this, and I think is extremely important to understand and talk about, is how, although we're going to focus very much on the economy as a system of violence, we have to keep an eye that these phenomena of violence and exploitation are never alone, in the sense that they are often layered systems of oppression. And that understanding of how very often people are subjected to layered systems of oppression, so layers of violence, and the notion that violence is always layered, is captured in the word intersectionality. We'll talk about that more in class, I hope. And basically the argument is that there's no thing as a single issue struggle, because we do not live single issued lives. So people are caught up in systems of oppression of race and class and gender, a topic that we have to bring in more explicitly, I think, in class, that are sort of layered and interact. And that is what is captured by this word intersectionality, and that's something that we have to keep in the back of our minds. I think, when analyzing this. But for the lecture, we'll focus a lot on global economy as a system of organization. Yeah. So to continue, structure-based approaches therefore then focus very much on the interconnectedness between the organization of society and violent conflict, and therefore the violence that is inherent to political, economic, and cultural structures. In a way, the violence in the normality of things, the violence produced through normality and through the everyday. Another framing would be to look at the conditions of possibility underpinning the rise of violent conflict. So very much stepping away from the actors fighting and understanding much more the conditions that underpin that violence. Now, of course, there's a lot of debate about that, and also a lot of debate out there trying to capture for instance, this topic of the global capitalist economy and how it produces forms of inequality and destruction and exploitation and violence that need to be addressed. And it's interesting in our current time that although there's very different positions on how to solve the problem of the contemporary global economy, and its unwanted effects, perhaps, there's a lot of consensus about the effect it has on societies. So if you take, for instance, the critical stance and you'd look at Oxfam, the NGO, and its yearly Davos report, they report about economic inequality every year, and they produce these very good reports. This year it's also very much about how economic inequality has an impact on women and gender. So the report, the Oxfam Davos report of 2020 is very much geared to that. So if you're interested in figures and numbers on that and the effect on women, by all means have a look. But the report says that the world's 2,000 something billionaires have more wealth than the 4.6 billion people who make up 60% of the planet's population, which is quite, mind-boggling. That just a bunch of billionaires, earns or has more wealth than 4.6 billion people. And another figure, that nearly half the world's population is living on less than $5.50 a day. Sort of gives you an idea of the remarkable inequality and wealth disparity that we see in our world today, something that has never been seen. And to establish that, you don't have to be a sort of a lefty critical, because that's absolutely, those figures are completely supported by also those who control the global economy. So those who are at Davos gathering each year to discuss the global economy. And it's interesting to see how those who hold power, economic power in a way, worry about this wealth inequality and the social instabilities it may cause. So World Economic Forum in 2018, World Economic Forum produces these risks reports every year. They're very interesting to look at. So what are the sort of the wealthy and the rich in the world see as problems and risks in the coming decade, for instance. And here, the World Economic Forum of 2018 would say that rising income and wealth disparity is ranking third as a driver of global risks over the next 10 years. So if they ask a bunch of sort of higher up business CEOs to report on what they consider to be risky, and here the business risks of highest concern globally in the risk report of 2019 of the World Economic Forum is that an economic slowdown would likely exacerbate deeply felt social dissatisfaction. And this risk also concerns business executives who identified failure of national governance, so lack of good governance, and profound social instability as the fifth and sixth global risks for doing business. So if public finance crises force a shrinkage of the welfare state, even more social disruption could be created. Failure of national governance was the #1 risk in Latin America and the Caribbean, while profound social instability topped the list in Eurasia. So it's very interesting to see that the analysis is not necessarily very different from those who are, critiquing the global economy, such as Oxfam, and those who are right inside of it. They see the same dangers. They definitely will have very different ideas about how to solve these. But it's interesting that by now there's no longer cleavage in what's going on and what is most likely going to happen as a result of this rising wealth disparity that we see in the world. So that's just give you an idea of where we are in that stance. And by all means, go visit the World Economic Forum and all its reports and risks, because it's interesting to see that perspective from those who hold economic power. What I'm going to do in this lecture for the remaining time is 3 things. First, we're going to discuss views on violence and conflict as structural, and very much draw on the work of Johan Galtung. Then we'll briefly look into what are these structures then, and how can we see a structure at work, and what type of research is done around those notions. And then as a third topic, I want to look into 3 concrete contradictions, and then I turn in the conclusions to our 3 main questions, the main questions of the course and the book. So let's first move now to discussions of violence and conflict. We already started out with looking at these. But if we look at the phenomenon of violence in the world today, we see a lot of these pictures. And that is the spectacular violence, the direct manifest violence that most of us is triggered by as researchers. But Johan Galtung, the author that we discuss a lot in the book and also today in this lecture, a sociologist who was very influential as a founding father, you could say, of the field of peace and conflict studies already in the 1960s, critiqued this form of spectacular violence as being the only phenomena that conflict studies and peace studies academics would look at. He would argue that we have to look at these settings as well. This is an old picture, but it could be, we could take similar pictures in the downtown San Francisco, where people are equally now standing in line to wait for the soup kitchen because they are unemployed and in dire need for food. And we would also see the same racial connotation here, where there's mostly, not only, but mostly people of color standing in these lines and being at the sort of the lower socio-economic echelons of society. So what I think this picture beautifully outlines is what Galtung would call structural and cultural violence, because clearly these people are deprived in large contrast to those who are, portrayed on the billboard behind them. So there's a clear ethnic racial divide there, but they're also clearly not part of the winners in a more cultural way. Sort of these are the losers, and perhaps this is also a story that sort of tells them that they're basically to blame themselves for being in this dire situation, because the US has the world's highest standard of living, and there's no way like the American way. And if you can't profit from that, if you can't be part of that, then there must be something wrong with you. Now that's exactly what Galtung wants us to look at these divides and these stories and these positions of worthy and unworthy and understand these as forms of violence as well. So when we go to his work, Galtung has a bunch of lessons to teach us. And one of the first things that he brought to the fore is that there's a difference between types of violence. There is forms of manifest and direct violence that we saw, pointed out in the picture too, the fighting and the physical hurt. But there's other forms of violence too, and that is what he calls structural violence, and later on we'll look at his definition of cultural violence. And structural violence, to Galtung, is a situation in which actual realizations of human beings are below their potential realizations. So avoidable insults to basic human needs and more generally life, lowering the real levels of need satisfaction below what is potentially possible. So with that definition of structural violence as sort of insults to basic human needs, and the structural constraints that deprive people of reaching their full potential and regretting reaching that full potential, it is what violence should also be about. So very much he very much brings in this notion of violence in the normality of things. Now you can ask, and we did this earlier in our debates, you can ask, well, why would you want to stretch the definition of violence in such a way and make it so massive and so broad? And evidently, Galtung did this with a purpose. We should also place him in his time. He produced this first piece on structural violence in 1969, and sort of acted against the very much dominant at the time behaviorist notions of violence, very much as in a restricted way, and he aimed to draw in the silent types of conflict, and he very much, with this new definition, politicized the notion of violence. Opening it up in this way, he clearly is casting blame and responsibility towards the system and the organization and structures of societies that keep people in certain places of top dogs and underdogs and exploitation, and bad health and low income, which in the end, he would also argue, are hurtful and harmful to people, also to their bodies. So there is forms of violence in the way our societies are organized, and some people are placed in very bad positions that are harmful and hurtful to them. So clearly, there's a political program underneath this definition. Now, Galtung not only gives us this sort of new definition of violence to think about and ponder about, but he also gave us the conflict triangle, and I want to say something about that as well. The conflict triangle, in a way, is a very simple but quite beautiful model to understand conflict, and most of the time the triangle is very much understood as helping us to highlight the dynamics and the life cycles of conflict, because the triangle is very often used as, you have the triangle, there's A, B, C, and what is argued that any conflict has three components. There is the C, which is the contradiction or the incompatibility, as we've seen in our definitions of violence. Then there's the A, which is about attitudes, and then there's the B, and that's behavior. So attitudes could be fear and disgust and contempt, and the B would then be discrimination or actual violence or exclusion, so active practices. And in his understanding of violent conflict, Galtung would argue we can start in any of these corners and see how a conflict goes through these dynamics of A, B, and C. And this gives us a way to understand the dynamics of a violent conflict quite well, in a quite nice, simple form. But there's much more to the conflict triangle, and that is not so often discussed, and that is how the conflict triangle also tells us another story, and that is how there's a difference in Galton's perception between actor conflict and structural conflict. And that is important in the sense that it leads us back to debates about structural approach to violent conflict. So what Galtung also is saying is that, okay, there's two types of conflict. In one type of conflict, the actor is fully aware of the A and the B and the C that are involved in the conflict that he's in. So he's aware of what the incompatibility is about. He's aware how he feels about that incompatibility, and he has a very clear plan of action. So he knows what he's going to do. And then the sort of the analogy would be a driver in a car who has a clear view and view of the road and control of the car, and is very clear about where he's going to, in full control. In these types of conflict, people can actually act realistically and perhaps fight their conflict or engage in that conflict in a realistic way. But most of the time, conflicts are not like that. People are not aware and often not conscious, or don't have a real awareness of the C component. So they have no good sense of what the incompatibility or the contradiction underlying the conflict is about. Or worse, perhaps they have a false image of C. So they have feelings, they have behaviors, but those are all geared towards a false or incorrect understanding of what is really driving a conflict. Now that seems a bit strange. We'll come back to then who decides on what is or what is not the real C. We'll talk about that later. But to give you an example, for instance, a group of workers feels frustration and anger about their unemployment, and they think the real C is that the incoming migrants that come into their country and steal their jobs, and they would argue that is that competition over jobs and the incoming migrants are the real contradiction, the real incompatibility that they're in, the real conflict. And they start to build up feelings of anger and towards these migrants, and start to act through discrimination or perhaps even violent attacks against these migrants. But in the end, what may be the case is that idea of the incoming migrants is not really what is the real C. The real C may be that because of the global economy, we see increasingly how corporations move out of high-income countries and resettle in low-income countries, and how that results in often workers losing their jobs. So the real C is not the migrants. The real C is the global economy. And by hitting on these migrants, they will never really solve their problems, because they're all going to be unemployed because of these shifting corporations. So in that sense, there may be a lot of violence and a lot of conflict and a lot of A, B's and C's, but it's unrealistic conflict, as Galton would argue, and also Marx would point it out, because it's never going to solve the problem, and people are not aware of the real C and therefore cannot solve their problem. And Galton would argue that most conflicts in the world today are these types of conflict, where actors are not aware or have a false idea of C, and that is what he calls a structural conflict. Okay. Now, I already asked that question. So yeah, okay, the real C, but then who decides in a situation, for instance, of these workers and the migrants that are stealing their jobs? Who then decides on the real C? If it's not people who are part of the conflict, who then is there some sort of God who decides, what the real C is, and how can we think about that real C? Well, and that is what Galtung would say, indeed. The real C, the real underlying C, is something that we have to understand as lying in the structure of the social system. So it's through the organization of the social system that there's, a contradiction which plays out in this way. So the real C lies in the structure of the social system. So something standing in the way of something else, and not in terms of, direct actors standing in the way of each other in terms of wanting to claim a plot of land and therefore seeing that they have incompatible goals. The incompatibility is more complex in the sense that it is embedded in the way we live our lives and in the way we have structured our social systems. And it therefore is also much more difficult to see and understand. And clearly he sort of now refers to the work of Karl Marx, whose entire work is based upon this notion that conflict stems from the inherent contradiction in the capitalist system. Because the capitalist system has a fundamental contradiction built into it in the relations of production, and how that produces interest groups that will eventually clash. So this notion of class conflict. And also very clearly, Marx already sort of gives us some input on what later on Galtung would call cultural violence. The problem is that indeed people very often don't see that, and it's also very hard to see that. And then Marx would argue that is because ideology makes it impossible for them to see it. So they do not know it, but they are doing it. So they are engaged in unrealistic violence or live their lives in ways that are actually in the end harmful to them because of the way they are placed in this relationship in which they are constantly placed in a position of exploitation. But how difficult it is to see what's going on. And that immediately leads us to then a set of questions that I think are very important to help us understand the literature, but also what the literature perhaps has to offer, is then, okay, if that's the case, if people are caught up in these structures, what prevents people from seeing the larger scope of what is at stake? And how do we get from structural conflict to actor conflict in the words of Galtung? So how can we become aware of what the real C is about and then engage in a realistic conflict? So how do we get there? We'll see how in the different authors in the literature would react to that question. Let's start with Galtung. Okay. Galtung has this beautiful quote that I, particularly as a political scientist, very much like. He argues that just as political science is about two problems, the use of power and the legitimation of the use of power, violence studies, or conflict studies, I would say, are about two problems, the use of violence and the legitimation of that use. Culture, or rather certain aspects of culture, teaches and dulls us into seeing repression and exploitation as normal, or rather not see it at all. And by cultural violence, Galtung means those aspects of culture, the symbolic sphere of our existence, exemplified by religion and ideology, languages and art, empirical science and formal science, that can be used to justify or legitimize direct or structural violence. So it is cultural, it's culture basically, it's culture that sort of it dulls us into not seeing what the real contradiction is about. And he gives this example that James Baldwin would immediately relate to, and that's an example on slavery. Africans are captured, forced across the Atlantic to work as slaves. Millions are killed in the process. In Africa, on board, in the Americas. The massive direct violence over century seeps down and sediments as massive structural violence, with whites as master top dogs and blacks as the slave underdogs, producing and reproducing massive cultural violence with racist ideas everywhere. After some time, direct violence is forgotten, slavery is forgotten, and only two labels show up, pale enough for college textbooks: discrimination for massive structural violence and prejudice for massive cultural violence. Sanitation of language, itself cultural violence. So that is the incredible power of cultural violence, according to Galtung, and one of the main reasons why it's very hard for people to see what is at stake. Gramsci gives us another answer. This is also a very important philosopher that you've probably come across in your undergraduate study, Antonio Gramsci, who in the prison notebooks wrote about sort of, yes, a critique on Marxian thought, and he introduced this very important notion of cultural hegemony in explaining why basically the idea of revolution wasn't taking shape at all. So why the prediction of Marx that soon the classes will rise was not actually happening. So, and the reason for that is that capitalism, according to Gramsci, is capable of sustaining itself not just through violence, economic coercion and political repression, but also ideologically, through a hegemonic culture in which the values of the dominant classes have become the common sense values of all. People lost in their daily routines and worries, and guided by symbolic orders and notions of normality and common sense, are incapable of perceiving the greater systemic nature of socioeconomic exploitation that cultural hegemony makes possible. So basically that notion how important culture is to cover up exploitative relationship is actually what the field of cultural studies, why the field of cultural studies in the academy was established. Although now I sometimes feel that that's been forgotten in most cultural studies departments, but that's very much the core of why it is important to study culture in cultural studies. And then there's Foucault, another important philosopher, and he shows us something similar by giving us the term governmentality, and by focusing on how we now have incorporated a lot of these ideologies and sort of internalized them in ways that we now self-discipline ourselves. So basically, global capitalism, or neoliberalism as we could call it, is a thing we do to ourselves. We have fully internalized the cultural scripts that come with global capitalism in terms of survivors and winners and losers mentalities, and worthy and unworthy citizens. And in that sense, we have internalized it so deeply that we now self-discipline ourselves into living according to these structures. So, in other words, that notion has seeped into the social and political fabric and deeply reconfigured people's relationships to each other, their sense of membership in the public, and the conditions of self-knowledge. So we basically self-understand ourselves as human capital now. We're all neoliberals now, in a sense. It's very hard to think outside of that script, that cultural script. So Wendy Brown wrote a fantastic book about that, about how we internalize that gaze, basically. So neoliberalism, in her book of 2015, is a logic of practice. It's a governing rationality through which the logic of the market, basically competition, utility maximization, and the commodification of everything, is extended to every dimension of human life. And we have completely self-disciplined ourselves into that sort of that notion of the human being as human capital only. So in the book, there's much more about that. Now then, the second question is of how do we get out of all of this? Is it possible to step out of this, according to the literature? And then there's different answers, but they're not entirely satisfactory in the sense that they're very vague. Of course, we know Marx and the Marxian thought about awakening the proletariat and this notion of historical materialism, where at a certain point is turning point is going to take place when there's so much inequality that the proletariat, those who are in the exploited position, will understand that it's time to rise up. But that has sort of been disproved by, I think, the force of culture. Gramsci would say we have to do it through educating the masses. So it has to happen through making people aware of their position in that relationship much more. And Freire, Galtung drawing on Freire, they talk about conscientization, but they also talk about sort of vaguely about reflexive capacities of those who are in conflict, and how frustration, for instance, is a very important stage that will, at a certain point, perhaps open people's eyes and make them understand how it's not individual stories of, indeed, gender exploitation and economic exploitation, but that they see that others are in the same place and that it's time to rise up and start mobilizing. Still pretty vague. The field that we're going to talk about next in our next session, that's collective action theory and mobilization theory, is much more concrete, and it's basically the entire field is trying to answer the question of how do people get out of oppressive systems, and what are the dynamics there. And I'm already giving you a little sneak preview by giving you this definition of what Sidney Tarot calls collective action frames. So as crucial in getting from settings of exploitation and unawareness to action and awareness. So that happens through collective action frames who can redefine social conditions as unjust and intolerable with the intention of mobilizing potential participants, which is achieved by making appeals to perceptions of justice and emotionality in the minds of individuals. So the entire field that we're going to talk about next week is very much about trying to answer that question of how to get out much more precisely than our current body of literature is helping us to do. Okay, so that was our first set of concepts and ideas around views on violence and conflict as structural instead of spectacular and manifest, and what we can take away from that. Now, as a second topic, I want to briefly say something about structures, because we've been using the word structures a lot, but then how do we recognize a structure? How do we establish what type of structure, what kind of organization of society, what type of relationship we together call a structure and see as having a certain effect on people? Well, that is one of the challenges of the field of structure-based analysis of violent conflict, is to understand what structures do we see at work. And it's critiqued for being vague and being subjective in the kind of establishment of what relationships together build a structure that is doing things. And Arjun Appadurai, a very good anthropologist, gives us this idea in his book of 2006, where globalization, and he could easily mean the global capitalist economy, is a force without a face. And although the changes it brings may give rise to deep anxieties and social uncertainties, it cannot be targeted in any satisfactory way. And I think that's very important, this notion that indeed these structural transformations that people are in are gradually transforming their lives in ways, but it's very hard. And again, we go back to Saskia Sassen. It's very hard to understand the lines of responsibility of who is doing this, because we're actually all doing this in a way. So although some profit from it and some really don't, and also how those who don't, for instance, the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest movement in France, is very much about workers and people in lower socioeconomic positions that begin to realize something's very wrong and it has to do something with the organization of our global economy. Still, it's very hard to target those then who are responsible and to come up with a story of lines of responsibility and to cast blame in an intelligent way. And that is why we often see that these frustrations over socioeconomic deprivations, for instance, translate into finding other faces that are then blamed for the uncertainties that are deeply felt. For instance, the ethnic other, but also how it turns inward in terms of domestic violence and femicide, and how then again intersectionality and layeredness of violence begins to play a very important role. So how, for instance, indeed, yeah, so I keep it to that, but that's something to think through much more deeply later. So then what are structures? Anthony Giddens gives us a very, very helpful definition of structures, because they're often hard to sort of grasp and ill understood. Structures are basically nothing more than the rules that tell us how to do social life. I always stick to that most simple definition. The rules that tell us how to do social life. In a more, refined definition, the rules and resources recursively implicated in the reproduction of social systems. Structures are thus rules that are articulated in social action, and tell people how to do social life, and then the resources on which people can call to achieve their objectives. So, but to keep with that notion that a structure is a set of rules that tell us how to do social life, that we often run into when they're practically spelled out to us, but also they're very often unwritten, much more subtle rules of normality and legitimacy that we follow unconsciously. And we'll come back to understanding structures more in depth in our final session. So then, if we want to see structures at work, if you want to do research on this, so how then do they materialize? How can you actually study them? Well, structures, as understood by Anthony Giddens and by most, I would argue, authors in the literature that we use, are not objective in the sense that they're sort of out there determining our lives. They are socially constructed. They're made by us, and therefore you could see them as some sort of rules of the game. Some rules that are institutionalized, such as, the economic game, the rules around money and the value of money, but also the rules around global economy with trade agreements and tariff agreements and contracts. So these are very clear sets of rules of how to play the game of the global economy. And these games, but they're also much more subtle games in terms of structures of patriarchy and gender domination. These are much more subtle of what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a good woman or a good man, and structures about rules about femininity and masculinity that are not written down but can be extremely consequential for people, in the sense that if you break certain rules of what it means to be a good woman, that could have very, very clear impacts on your life and your safety. So structures then as rules of games that we play, and these games have specific as constitutive and regulative rules and practices, and these translate into institutions and stories and institutional practices and discursive practices that we can identify and study. So we'll talk about this later in our final session, but structures they do materialize in sets of rules and in institutions and in practices that we can actually use as researchers to study and map and understand. So in that sense, in many ways, to do structure-based research is not as vague as perhaps you might feel it could be. So with that, we close the second topic of this lecture, and we've sort of uncovered a bit this notion of what a structure is, but we will come back to this later in more elaborate form. So I want to end the lecture by looking at our third topic, and that is to say something about concrete contradictions as identified by important voices in the literature on structure-based analyses of violent conflict, who highlight the relationship between global systems and local conflicts, and help us to think through then how to sort of put this to work, this theory. In the book, I identify three very important contradictions that are spelled out in the literature, in the very different and also sometimes fragmented literature on structure-based analysis. So there's one set of contradiction which looks at the modern state system. And the modern state system, for instance, Mohammed Ayub would argue, has a very strong internal contradiction built into it, in the sense that effective states that have completed their nation-state building processes, often at the expense of ineffective ones, through colonial rule, set the liberal standards that are in contradiction to the imperatives of state-making in large parts of the South. Now, this is very much what the work of Mohammed Ayub is about. So we have effective states, mostly states who were colonizers and who are placed in the West, that have, through a lot of bloodshed and through a lot of war making, come to a position where they now have pretty strong national states and also a sense of national identities build up, are now sort of setting the global standards of human rights and human security, and impose that upon those states that are struggling to get through state formation processes, and cannot make use of the bloodshedding and the repression and the violence that these modern states in the West largely resorted to. So you have this contradiction of some states telling what the good state should be, and constantly also emphasizing how others are fragile and failed and hybrid and incomplete and bad even too, in terms of bad governance, but how that has come out of a system of colonial rule and global economic dynamics that are then easily forgotten within that setting of the modern state system. Also the notion that a lot of countries in the global South will therefore never be able to come to some sort of stable state formation process. A second main big contradiction is something that I already discussed quite a lot, is how there's a contradiction in the structure of the global capitalist system, where international rules and regulations of market integration have stripped national governments of their power to control economic dynamics. So that is how, indeed, the global move to neoliberalism and privatization and opening up borders have led to incredible ways of capital accumulation and wealth accumulation by some actors and some communities, whereas in other locations it's stripped very often upcoming new states, post-colonial states, post-communist states, from the capacity to actually build up some sort of solid national economy, because they immediately had to compete on the global capitalist market, and in that sense couldn't build up their national economies in ways that others have done in the past. So there's a huge contradiction there. And then the third contradiction pointed out by Mark Duffield's work, very closely linked to the first and the second, is how there's now a global governance system in place where the metropolitan states, so again those who are the first world or the global north states, through a whole set of technologies of power and biopower and humanitarian and military interventions, keep borderland populations in place. So that's the whole issue of how we need some sort of surplus labor, but then we have to keep it in its place, and how all kinds of new migration regulations and forms of biopower are making this work. There's actually people, my neighbors are moving, so there might be a bit of noise here and there. So three pretty big contradictions in the global system: state system, capitalist system, and the global governance system. Now, why do we want to talk about that? Why is that important? Because these crises or these contradictions, I'd say it's not necessarily crises, because some people really do well on certain ends of that relationship. But it leads to something that is key in most discussions about contemporary violent conflict, and that is it undermines the role and formation of the state. So each of these three contradictions plays into state impotence, you could say, in different ways. The state, the welfare state, the import industry, the IC state, so the industrial substitution, industrialization state of, for instance, Latin America, which was a type of welfare state, you could argue, but also the protectionism that we saw in places like India and Indonesia, have all been eroded through privatization and neoliberalization, basically. And this all had, and these other two contradictions that I pointed out, have all led to a decrease in state capacity. So decline of state formation as a political project results in a loss or a lack of legitimacy of political classes and nurtures new forms of identity conflict. Now, I should say this better. So the first point is that these three contradictions play out on the level of the state, and the state is losing power and capacity because of the way these three global systems play out. And this state impotence relates to violent conflict in three different ways, through three different trajectories, you could say. The first trajectory, and I'm sorry, I already started saying that, but that was incorrect. So the first form in which this plays out in violent conflict is through identity conflicts. Identity conflicts, as being on the rise. And these identity conflicts, they start because the state, in many ways, in many societies in the world today, particularly from the 1980s onward, has difficulty in delivering its political promises, but also its promises of accommodation and socioeconomic distribution. And we see this coming to a crisis, I'd say, in this decade, particularly, where there's a crisis in state governance and the delivery of basic services. That is now, with the Corona times, played out massively, I'd say. So the decline of the state as a political project results in a loss of legitimacy of those who are in control of the state, because they don't control economic forces any longer, and they cannot deliver in many ways, and therefore they have to turn to other ways to distinguish themselves and to build a constituency. And we see very often politicians then turn to playing the ethnic identity card or the religious card, then to move to spheres where they do feel they have something to impactful to say and to do, and through those narratives draw draw a constituency. So, and that will result in identity conflicts. So identity as a new terrain for politicians the only terrain left basically for politicians to do politics. The second way in which we can see how state impotence plays out in violent conflict is that the state no longer is the main trophy in violent conflict because of its weakness, because there's very little economic power in the state. We see increasingly how economic groups operate around the state through what is called network wars, militarized corporate enclave economies, and how indeed there's all these networks of warlords and multinational corporations making all kinds of deals, and the state really doesn't play a role here any longer, and therefore capturing the state is considered of not so much importance anymore in many violent formations that we see in the world today. So we see a move to network wars. And then the third form in which we can see how state impotence plays out violently is the shift from the social state or the welfare state to what we could call a control state. And that is what is referred to in works that refer to the militarization of the social and, for instance, military neoliberalism, where we can see that through austerity and privatization of the past decades, we see the ending of a more consensual and stable form of governance through welfare and through accommodating grievances from society and accommodating unrest by controlling and repressing forms of unrest and civil mobilization. So we see a shift from accommodating to policing all the anxieties and instabilities that are produced by neoliberal transformations, and the anger of civilians is now hit on hard through the rise of the control state and the militarization of the police. So again, tying very much into our debates about what's going on in terms of police violence in the world today. Okay, so those are the three forms in which we can see the link between global systems and structured in certain ways and local formations of violent confrontation. They work through the state that is increasingly impotent and incapable to accommodate demands from society, and that plays out in identity conflicts, ethnic card playing, religious script playing. It plays out in forms of network wars where the state is just worked around, and it works out in terms of the rise of the control state, the surveillance state, as the new face of the state globally. Okay, and with that we come to the final part of the lecture. We're going to try and start answering the three questions of our course. So why do people what makes a group? Because that's our first question. We see quite a different answer to this question than we've seen in the earlier sessions, where most of the authors arguing from a structure-based position would say the real groups in conflict are produced by the contradiction in the structure of the system. So groups in Marxian terms are individuals who share a similar position in the market economy. However, people generally fail to see what it is that is standing in their way. Their social uncertainties and frustrations are very often projected onto false enemies and threats. Think about migrants again, and hence translate into unrealistic forms of violence. So the real group, according to structure-based authors, is very often the socioeconomic group, a class group, but that is very often not acknowledged and not seen and understood by actors in the world today. And therefore we see a lot of unrealistic forms and false consciousness. So how and why does a group resort to violence? Well, that's also a very different answer than we've seen earlier. Indirectly, the forms of structural violence done to people through the organization of society, so the way they are being oppressed and exploited through the everyday normalities, in the end prepare the ground for direct violence. That is sort of the main argument. So the violence inherent to the structure of the system in the end contains the intrinsic capacity to provoke direct violence. So this has some sort of programmatic notion built into it that eventually people will indeed hit on the wrong enemies, but gradually they'll find, through trial and error basically, realistic violence will evolve, and then the real conflict can start basically. So somehow the frustrations and the anger build up through exploitation in terms of gender exploitation and femicide, through racial institutional racism and constant police harassment, and also through constantly exploiting the larger classes, the lower classes. That anger and frustration will at a certain point find its expression in actual direct violence. And first it will be very often unrealistic violence, but eventually it might also turn into realistic violence. And then why or how and why do they or don't they stop? Well, that answer is very straightforward. It requires structural change to end or transform violent conflict. So only if indeed the rules of the game are fundamentally transformed will we see a transformation in terms of conflict as well. And here, if we just quickly go back to Galtung and his triangle, he very strongly argues that very often in the world today we see a lot of emphasis on trying to change the A corner of our conflict triangle. So there's a lot of NGO work going into changing attitudes of people, so make them less fearful and make them less hateful of the other through reconciliation efforts. There's also a lot of emphasis on the B part, the behavior part of our conflict triangle, so to try and change people's conflict behavior by making them less violent or less discriminatory, and trying to work on that through settlements. So very much, trying to make them stop acting violently. But that will never be enough. Galtung would argue. The reconciliation and the settlement are given way too much attention in the world of NGOs, because the only real solution is to focus on the C. So that is only when conflict resolution starts, but when we begin addressing the C, the real contradiction in the structure of the system, that is feeding into systems of oppression and exploitation. And only if we can address that and stop that from doing its destructive work can we get into forms of positive peace through conflict resolution. So basically that is the story of the structure-based analysis. Structural change is the only solution to end violent conflict. As I said earlier, next week we're going to look much more into then the how of this transformation and how to move from situations of exploitation to resistance and transformation. And that is the large and again fragmented field of mobilization theory and collective action theory. So for now, this was the lecture on structure-based and structural views on violent conflict. And I hope to see you soon when we talk about mobilization. Bye.